They say blood is thicker than water, but when the scent of money fills the air, it can curdle even the purest of bonds, turning a family into a pack of wolves. This truth had never been more apparent than within the sterile, mahogany-paneled conference room of a high-priced law firm. There, Eleanor Vance, a woman of 80 years, sat silently in her wheelchair, her gaze distant, her eyes clouded with a sorrow that ran deeper than her physical frailties. On her left sat Michael, her son, his handsome face etched with a look of feigned concern that failed to mask the impatience in his eyes. On her right was Catherine, her daughter, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief in a theatrical display of grief. They were not flanking her out of love, but as predators circling their prize. Their voices cut through the solemn quiet of the room, sharp and laced with manufactured righteousness. Michael, a real estate developer whose ambition had always outpaced his success, argued for the necessity of placing Eleanor in a premier assisted living facility, the best money can buy, he'd said, as if the price tag was a measure of his devotion. Catherine, who had crafted a life of suburban perfection funded by a generous allowance from her parents, countered with saccharine sweetness, insisting that a mother's place was with her family, that she alone could provide the loving care Eleanor deserved. But their words were a smokescreen, a carefully constructed facade for the benefit of the family lawyer, Mr. Harrison, who looked on with an expression of weary resignation. The real prize they fought for was not the well-being of Eleanor, but the legal guardianship that came with it, the golden key to a vast fortune, accumulated over a lifetime by Eleanor and her late husband. Eleanor, trapped within a body that had betrayed her after a mild stroke, but with a mind as sharp and clear as ever, saw it all with a devastating clarity. She saw the avarice glittering behind Michael's concerned frown, the desperate calculation in Catherine's sorrowful performance. The love they professed was a hollow echo, drowned out by the deafening clamor of their own needs. She was no longer their mother, she was a vault to be cracked. The air in the room was thick with unspoken cruelties and suffocating greed, a prelude to the storm that was about to break over the once proud house of Vance. To understand the depth of the rot that had set into the Vance family, one must first understand the woman at its center, Eleanor. She was not born into wealth. She was born into a world of books, the daughter of a humble librarian who taught her that words held more power than any currency. She had become a literature teacher, shaping young minds with Shakespeare and Faulkner, her classroom a sanctuary of quiet intellect. It was there she met her husband, Robert Vance, not a man of letters, but a man of numbers, a brilliant investor who saw the world as a complex equation he was uniquely gifted to solve. He was captivated by her sharp mind and calm strength, and she by his unwavering integrity and the quiet intensity with which he approached life. Together, they built an empire, not just of wealth, but of shared values. Robert handled the investments, growing their fortune with a prudence and foresight that seemed almost prophetic, while Eleanor built their home, filling a sprawling Connecticut estate not just with fine art and antiques, but with warmth, laughter, and the scent of old paper from thousands of books. Now, Robert was gone. 5 years passed since cancer had solved the one equation he could not, and Eleanor, once the vibrant heart of the home, was a queen trapped in a failing castle. A stroke, minor by medical standards, had been a thief in the night, stealing the crispness from her voice and the certainty from her limbs. It had confined her to a wheelchair, her words emerging slowly, often slurred, a frustrating prison for a mind that still raced with poetic clarity. She was forced to rely on others for the simplest of tasks, a vulnerability her own children now wielded as a weapon against her. She had raised them in a world of comfort, shielded them from want, taught them to appreciate the arts and to be kind. She had given them everything. But somewhere along the way, in the fertile soil of privilege, she had unknowingly planted the seeds of entitlement and greed. Now, sitting in the sun-drenched library Robert had built for her, surrounded by the silent wisdom of 1,000 authors, Eleanor saw the bitter harvest. She saw that the children she loved were strangers, their faces familiar masks, hiding the covetous desires of their hearts. Michael was the firstborn, the crown prince. He had always been blessed with his father's ambition, but none of his patience. He carried himself with an air of effortless success, dressed in bespoke suits, driving a German sports car, and speaking of million-dollar deals with a casual swagger. To the outside world, he was the worthy successor to the Vance legacy, a titan of real estate carving his own path. It was a masterful illusion. In reality, Michael was a gambler who had mistaken recklessness for genius. He was drowning. Risky ventures, leveraged to the hilt, were collapsing around him. The lavish lifestyle he flaunted was a mountain of debt, and his creditors were no longer patient. The confident facade was cracking, and underneath was a desperate, panicked man. He didn't look at his mother and see the woman who had once read him bedtime stories. He saw a lifeline. He saw a financial portfolio, a collection of assets, a solution to his self-inflicted ruin. The guardianship he sought was not for her protection, but for his own. The plan to move her to a facility was not about her care, but about liquidating her primary asset, the family home, to pour water on the fires of his financial implosion. He felt no guilt. In his mind, the money was already his, a birthright he was simply claiming ahead of schedule. Then there was Catherine, the baby of the family, the picture of suburban grace. Her life was a meticulously curated gallery displayed on social media. Charity luncheons, idyllic family vacations, a perfectly decorated home. She had married a man with a promising career and had dedicated herself to the role of the perfect wife and mother. She presented herself as the gentle, caring one, the daughter whose heart bled for her ailing mother. This too was a lie. Her performance was driven by a terror just as potent as Michael's. Her husband's promising career had evaporated weeks ago in a wave of corporate downsizing, a humiliating secret they guarded with paranoid vigilance. The country club membership, the private school tuition, the designer wardrobe, it was all built on a foundation that had just crumbled. Catherine was staring into an abyss, not of financial ruin like Michael, but of social extinction. To lose the lifestyle she had so carefully constructed was, to her, a fate worse than death. Her desire to care for her mother at home was a strategic move. It painted her as the dutiful, loving child, the moral opposite of her seemingly callous brother. But her plan was just as insidious. With Eleanor under her roof, Catherine could control everything: the flow of information, the narrative, and most importantly, the checkbook. She would become the indispensable caregiver, slowly siphoning funds under the guise of household expenses and medical necessities, a quiet, steady bleed that would keep her perfect world from collapsing. Her feigned tears were not for her mother's decline, but for the terrifying fragility of her own status. The Vance family estate, the grand old house in Connecticut, stood as a silent testament to the family's decay. It was more than brick and mortar. It was a living museum of their history. The worn armchair where Robert used to read the paper, the faint pencil marks on a doorframe measuring the children's growth, the grand piano in the foyer that had been silent for years. These halls, once filled with the echoes of a happy family, now held a tense, suffocating silence, broken only by the strained pleasantries and veiled accusations of Eleanor's children. They walked through the rooms of their childhood not with nostalgia, but with the cold eyes of appraisers, their memories overwritten by dollar signs. And in the center of it all sat Eleanor, a silent observer on a velvet throne, watching the play she had never wished to see, a tragedy of her own making, where the children she had given the world now sought to take it all away. The first shot was fired not with a heated word, but with the sterile rustle of legal papers. A process server, a stranger with a neutral expression, delivered a thick manila envelope to Catherine's perfectly manicured doorstep. Inside, couched in the cold, dispassionate language of the law, was Michael's formal petition to the court. He was seeking full conservatorship over the person and estate of Eleanor Vance. The documents were a masterclass in calculated cruelty. They included a detailed medical evaluation from a doctor Catherine had never heard of, a report that twisted Eleanor's physical challenges into a portrait of complete mental incompetence. It spoke of cognitive decline, impaired judgment, and an inability to comprehend financial matters. It painted Eleanor not as a woman recovering from a stroke, but as a ghost, a hollowed-out version of her former self, incapable of making even the simplest decisions. Michael's petition concluded with his solemn filial proposal to sell the family home, which he described as a hazardous and unsuitable environment for an elderly individual, and to use the proceeds to place Eleanor in the gilded cage of the Oakwood Meadows Premier Care Facility, where she could live out her days in safety and security. Catherine's reaction was a storm of performative fury. She wept on the phone to her lawyer, her voice trembling with indignation as she decried Michael's monstrous betrayal. How could he be so heartless, so clinical, so eager to cast their mother aside like a piece of unwanted furniture? Within days, she launched her counteroffensive. Her own legal filing was a tapestry of sentimentality and emotional blackmail. It was filled with loving anecdotes from their childhood, sworn affidavits from neighbors attesting to her devotion, and a tear-jerking personal statement about the sacred bond between a mother and daughter. She accused Michael of being a cold-hearted materialist, blinded by ambition, who saw their mother as a burden to be managed rather than a parent to be cherished. Her proposal was the polar opposite of his. Eleanor would remain in her beloved home, surrounded by a lifetime of memories, and Catherine herself would be her primary caregiver. To facilitate this noble sacrifice, of course, she also petitioned for control of the estate, framing it as a practical necessity. She would need access to the funds, she argued, to hire supplemental in-home nurses, to make the house more accessible, to ensure their mother wanted for nothing. It was a brilliant move, positioning her as the protector of both her mother's heart and her legacy. The first hearing took place in a drab, soulless courtroom that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The warmth and history of the Vance family home felt a universe away. Eleanor sat between her two children, a silent island in a sea of animosity. They did not speak to her, nor to each other. They communicated only through their lawyers, who stood before the judge and presented their sanitized, conflicting narratives. Michael's attorney, a man with a stern jaw and a pinstripe suit, spoke of pragmatism and responsibility. He presented Michael as the dutiful son, making a difficult but necessary choice for his mother's own good. He waved the exaggerated medical reports like a banner of truth. Then, Catherine's lawyer, a woman with a soft, empathetic voice, took her turn. She spoke of love, compassion, and the sanctity of family. She painted Catherine as a selfless martyr, willing to put her own life on hold for the mother who gave her everything. Through it all, Eleanor remained still, her hands clasped in her lap. She was a living person being discussed as if she were a problematic piece of property. Her desires, her thoughts, her very essence were deemed irrelevant. A fire of silent rage began to burn through the fog of her physical weakness. She would not be invisible. With a trembling hand, she reached for the notepad and pen that Mr. Harrison, her own quiet lawyer, had placed on the table before her. Her fingers, stiff and uncooperative, struggled to form the letters. The pen shook, the lines were jagged, but the message was clear. 4 simple words: I want to go home. She slid the paper toward the center of the table. For a moment, it felt like a victory, a small shout in a room determined to silence her. Michael's lawyer glanced at it and gave a dismissive, pitying smile. Catherine's lawyer looked at it with a sad shake of her head, as if to say, "You see? She is confused." The judge, a man with tired eyes who had seen this same sad play countless times, acknowledged the note with a brief nod before turning back to the lawyers. Her one act of defiance had been absorbed into their narrative and twisted into further proof of her incompetence. It was the cruelest blow of all. The judge, faced with 2 warring children and a silent parent, made the only decision he could. He declared that he would not make a final ruling until an independent evaluation could be conducted. He appointed a guardian ad litem, a social worker named Sarah Jenkins, to act as the court's eyes and ears. Sarah would visit the Vance home, interview Eleanor, Michael, and Catherine, and provide an unbiased report on what was truly in Eleanor Vance's best interests. A temporary truce had been called, but for Michael and Catherine, the war had just entered a new, more treacherous phase. They left the courtroom that day, not as siblings, but as combatants, retreating to their respective corners to plot their next moves in the shadows. And Eleanor, being wheeled out into the harsh afternoon light, made a silent vow. They thought she was a pawn in their game. They would soon learn she was the one controlling the board. The judge's ruling transformed the Vance family home from a sanctuary into a meticulously monitored stage. With the impending evaluation by the court-appointed social worker, Sarah Jenkins, a new, colder war began between Michael and Catherine. This was a war to be fought not with lawyers and petitions, but with whispers, manipulations, and the quiet poison of manufactured concern. Every action was a performance, every word a line in a script, all for an audience of one whose report would seal their mother's fate and their own financial futures. Catherine, ever the master of appearances, made the first grand gesture. She packed a set of expensive suitcases and moved into one of the mansion's guest rooms, a public declaration of her selfless sacrifice. Her days became a relentless pageant of devotion. She filled the house with the scent of organic soups Eleanor had always disliked, and played classical music that grated on her mother's nerves. She would sit by Eleanor's wheelchair for hours, reading classic novels aloud in a dramatic, theatrical voice, as if auditioning for a role. When she knew a visit from the social worker was imminent, her performance would intensify. She'd brush Eleanor's hair with tender strokes, pat her hand with loving condescension, and speak in a syrupy sweet tone about the precious memories they were making. But the moment the door closed, the mask would slip. The gentle touch on Eleanor's shoulder would become an impatient grip, urging her towards the bathroom. The sweet nothings would be replaced by heavy, martyred sighs. "You have no idea what I've given up to be here, Mother," she'd mutter under her breath, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear, turning her care into a currency of guilt. Worse than the suffocating fussiness was the isolation. Catherine began to systematically cut Eleanor off from the world. When old friends from her book club would call, Catherine would answer with a voice dripping with sorrow, explaining that Mother was far too tired or having a confused day and couldn't possibly come to the phone. She was building a wall around Eleanor, brick by brick, ensuring that the only narrative the outside world heard was her own tale of saintly daughterhood. Eleanor was a prisoner in her own home, her silence twisted into a weapon Catherine used to fortify her position. Michael, barred from playing the role of the live-in caregiver, waged his campaign from the shadows. He understood that he couldn't beat Catherine at the game of overt affection, so he chose the path of sabotage. His weapon was a part-time home health aide named Gina, a young woman whose tired eyes betrayed a life lived on the financial edge. During a brief, concerned visit to the house, Michael had cornered her in the hallway, his charm dialed to its most effective setting. He spoke of his deep worry for his mother, his suspicion that Catherine, despite her best intentions, was overwhelmed. Then came the offer, a thick envelope of cash in exchange for information. He wanted to know everything. Was Catherine patient? Did she ever raise her voice? Most importantly, did she ever make a mistake with their mother's complex medication schedule? Gina, seeing an amount of money that could solve a month's worth of problems, agreed without hesitation. She became Michael's spy. His visits to the house were brief, polished, and perfectly timed. He would arrive bearing extravagant bouquets of lilies that made Eleanor sneeze, or boxes of expensive Belgian chocolates she was forbidden to eat. He would ignore Catherine and direct his attention to his mother, speaking to her in a loud, slow, patronizing voice, as if her hearing and intellect had vanished along with her mobility. "Mother," he'd boom, forcing a cheerful smile. "Are you feeling all right today? Is my sister remembering to give you your pills on time?" He'd ask leading questions, planting seeds of doubt for anyone who might be listening, especially Gina, who would be dutifully taking notes nearby. He was not there to connect with his mother. He was there to gather ammunition, to find the single crack in Catherine's facade that he could exploit in court. Eleanor sat at the silent, observing center of this swirling vortex of deceit. She was the prize in a tug of war that stretched and strained the last remaining threads of her maternal affection. She endured Catherine's cloying, insincere care, recognizing the bitter resentment that simmered just beneath the surface. She felt the chill of her daughter's frustration in the mornings and the weight of her sighs at night. She also saw through Michael's transparent manipulations. She noticed the way Gina the aide watched her with an unnerving intensity, her gaze lingering a little too long on the pill organizer. She saw the predatory gleam in Michael's eye as he feigned concern. His questions not inquiries of love, but the cross-examination of a hostile witness. The pain of their initial greed was now eclipsed by a deeper, more profound agony, the utter disrespect. They no longer saw her as a person. She was an obstacle, a bank account, a problem to be managed, or a tool to be used. They had stripped her of her dignity, her autonomy, and her identity, leaving only a frail old woman in a wheelchair. But they were wrong. The frail old woman was watching, listening, and remembering every slight, every lie, every betrayal. The fire that had been kindled in the courtroom was now a controlled, cold rage. The grief for the children she had lost was hardening into a resolve made of steel. They thought this was their game, their war to win. They had no idea that their mother, in her silence, was already planning a countermove, one that would not just defeat them, but utterly decimate them. The atmosphere of calculated performances and simmering hostility was unexpectedly pierced by the arrival of Sarah Jenkins. She was not what Michael or Catherine had anticipated. They had expected a weary, overworked bureaucrat, someone easily swayed by a display of wealth or a well-rehearsed sob story. Instead, the woman who stepped into the Vance mansion was in her late 40s, with calm, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a quiet air of authority that was impossible to dismiss. Sarah was the guardian ad litem assigned by the court, and her background as a geriatric nurse gave her a formidable, dual-pronged expertise. She understood not only the legal intricacies of the case, but the subtle, often unspoken realities of elder care. Her first official visit was a masterclass in observation. Catherine, alerted to her arrival, was in full Florence Nightingale mode. She was fluffing Eleanor's pillows and speaking in a soothing, melodic voice when Sarah walked in. Michael, conveniently, had also dropped by with a pot of expensive orchids, and he greeted Sarah with a firm handshake and a somber, responsible expression. They immediately launched into their competing narratives, a duet of devotion and concern. Catherine spoke of their mother's fragility and her own round-the-clock sacrifices. Michael talked gravely about the complexities of his mother's medical needs and the importance of professional supervision. Sarah listened to them both with polite attention, but her true focus was on Eleanor. Unlike everyone else, she didn't talk about Eleanor as if she were an inanimate object. She pulled up a chair, positioned it so she was at eye level with the woman in the wheelchair, and spoke to her directly. "Hello, Eleanor," she said, her voice warm but not patronizing. "My name is Sarah. The court has asked me to spend some time with you to understand what you want." It was a revolutionary concept. For weeks, no one had bothered to ask Eleanor what she wanted. The question itself was a small spark of light in a very dark room. When Eleanor responded, her words slow and slurred, Sarah did not interrupt or look away in discomfort. She leaned in, listening with a patient intensity that was more valuable than any empty platitude. She saw the sharp, lucid intelligence behind the struggling words, the frustration and fire in eyes that everyone else had dismissed as vacant. She also noticed the almost imperceptible tightening in Catherine's jaw and the flicker of annoyance in Michael's gaze as she directed her attention to their mother. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah's visits became a regular part of the household rhythm and a source of constant anxiety for the siblings. She had an unnerving ability to see through their charade. She noticed that the healthy, organic meals Catherine bragged about were often left untouched on Eleanor's plate. She observed that while Catherine's words were gentle, she would often grip Eleanor's arm with unnecessary firmness when moving her from the chair to the bed. She noted that Michael's concerned questions about medication were always conveniently timed to coincide with her visits. Sarah began to request time alone with Eleanor, politely but firmly dismissing Catherine's insistence that she stay and help. It was in these quiet moments that the fortress around Eleanor's heart began to crumble. Sarah didn't push or interrogate. She simply shared the space. She would talk about her own day, or the weather, or a funny story about her dog. One afternoon, she picked up a well-worn copy of Moby Dick from a side table. "This is a serious undertaking," Sarah said with a smile. "I've tried 3 times and never made it past the first 100 pages. Eleanor's eyes lit up. With painstaking effort, she spoke a single, clear word. "Ishmael." Sarah understood. She wasn't just talking to a patient, she was talking to a former literature teacher. A bond began to form, woven from quiet understanding and mutual respect. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Catherine was out for a desperately needed shopping trip, and Michael was not scheduled to visit. The house was quiet. Sarah was sitting with Eleanor in the library, the room that was most truly hers. For a long time, Eleanor was silent, her gaze fixed on a particular section of the towering bookshelves. Then, slowly, she lifted a trembling hand and pointed. Sarah followed her gaze to a row of leather-bound books that looked different from the others. They were not classics, but simple, elegant journals. "Your diaries?" Sarah asked softly. Eleanor gave a slow, deliberate nod. Sarah carefully retrieved one of the volumes. The pages were filled with Eleanor's strong, flowing script, a relic from a time before her body had betrayed her. Eleanor guided Sarah with a series of gestures and faint sounds. A finger tap on a date, a low hum to indicate a specific passage. It was a laborious, painstaking process, a form of communication born of desperation and trust. And as Sarah read, the true, horrifying story began to unfold, written in Eleanor's own words. She read about Michael's frantic phone calls, long before the stroke, begging for loans to cover his temporary business shortfalls. She read Eleanor's heartbroken entries about discovering the extent of Catherine's husband's financial troubles and her daughter's obsessive fear of social ruin. The journals were a meticulous record of their escalating greed and her own growing disillusionment. It was all there, the lies, the manipulations, the entitlement. It was a confession, an indictment, and a cry for help. For hours, they sat together, the quiet turning of pages punctuated by Eleanor's soft noises of confirmation. When they were finished, there were tears in Sarah's eyes, not of pity, but of anger. Eleanor Vance was no longer a case file, a set of medical reports, or a legal problem to be solved. She was a woman who had been profoundly betrayed, a silent witness to the decay of her own family. And in that quiet, rain-swept library, an unspoken alliance was forged. Eleanor was no longer alone. She had found her voice, her advocate, and her first soldier in the war that was to come. The plan for justice had begun. The alliance with Sarah Jenkins did more than just break Eleanor's isolation. It rekindled a fire within her that she thought had been extinguished forever. The weeks of being treated as a fragile object, a problem to be managed, had forged her grief and disappointment into something harder and sharper, a cold, unwavering resolve. This was no longer just about self-preservation. It was about justice. A profound, teachable moment was required, a lesson etched so deeply into the lives of her children that it would alter their very foundations. She was no longer a victim in their drama. She would be its author. Her first move was to secure a legal ally. With painstaking effort, using the now established method of pointing to words and phrases in her journals, Eleanor communicated her urgent desire to Sarah. She needed to speak with Mr. Harrison, the family lawyer, alone. It was a significant risk. Catherine monitored all visitors with the diligence of a prison warden. But Sarah was resourceful. She called Mr. Harrison's office, explaining that as part of her evaluation for the court, she required a private consultation with Mrs. Vance and her legal counsel to review the estate's current status. It was a perfect pretext, a request so professional and bureaucratic that Catherine couldn't possibly object without raising suspicion. Mr. Harrison arrived the following afternoon, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Catherine ushered him and Sarah into the library, offering them tea and hovering anxiously, ready to play the part of the helpful assistant. Sarah, however, gently but firmly closed the library doors on her, stating, "Thank you, Catherine. We need this time to be confidential for legal reasons." The click of the latch was the sound of the first lock being picked. Alone with Sarah and the lawyer, Eleanor got straight to the point. With Sarah's help as an interpreter, she made her intentions clear. She wanted to change her will, radically. Mr. Harrison, a man accustomed to the predictable rhythms of estate law, was taken aback. He looked at Eleanor, at her frail body and the difficulty with which she communicated, and his face filled with the same doubt she had seen in so many others. But then Sarah slid one of Eleanor's journals across the polished mahogany table, open to an entry from 6 months prior. In it, Eleanor had detailed, with heartbreaking clarity, a conversation where Michael had aggressively pressured her to liquidate a stock portfolio to cover his speculative real estate losses. As Mr. Harrison read his old client's words, his expression shifted from skepticism to a slow-burning anger. He looked up from the page and met Eleanor's eyes. He saw not confusion, but a fierce, blazing intelligence. His loyalty to his old friend, Robert Vance, and his own dormant sense of justice was awakened. "I understand, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and firm. "Tell me what you want to do." With her legal flank secured, Eleanor revealed her secret weapon. This was a secret she had held even from Mr. Harrison, a piece of her husband's meticulous, sometimes paranoid, nature. One evening, when they were alone, she guided Sarah not to the library, but to Robert's study, a room that had been largely untouched since his death. It was a masculine space of leather and dark wood, a monument to a brilliant mind. Eleanor directed Sarah to a shelf of financial ledgers. Behind them, seamlessly integrated into the woodwork, was a small, almost invisible metal grate. Sarah gently pried it open. Nestled inside was a compact, high-fidelity, voice-activated audio recorder. Robert, a man who believed in documenting everything, had installed it years ago to dictate notes and record important phone calls. It was a relic of his methodical nature, forgotten by all but his wife. Suddenly, it was the most important object in the house, a silent, impartial witness. The discovery transformed the nature of their mission. They were no longer simply gathering evidence of past wrongs. They were setting a trap to capture future sins. Eleanor, with an act of will that took all her strength, began to lean into the role her children had assigned her. She became more withdrawn, her responses slower, her gaze more distant. She allowed a vacant look to settle on her face whenever Michael or Catherine were near, lulling them into a state of supreme overconfidence. They saw a fading mind, a blank slate upon which they could project their own desires. They had no idea she was a predator, feigning weakness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trap did not take long to spring. Michael, increasingly frantic as his debts mounted, began using his father's old study for his private, desperate phone calls. He believed the thick oak doors guaranteed his privacy. He stood less than 10 feet from the hidden microphone, his voice a venomous cocktail of rage and entitlement, as he berated his bankers and promised them a massive infusion of cash as soon as he had control of his mother's unwieldy estate. "Just a few more weeks," he snarled into his phone one afternoon. "The old woman is practically a ghost. Once the court signs off, I'll liquidate the house and the whole portfolio. You'll get your money." Catherine, too, provided them with ample material. Her frustration at the prolonged legal process and the exhausting charade of her caregiving began to boil over. She would retreat to the study to complain to her husband on speakerphone, her voice a sharp, whining counterpoint to Michael's angry tirades. "I can't keep this up much longer," she lamented, her voice echoing off the leather-bound books. "She's like a child. I spoon-feed her. I bathe her. And for what? For Michael to try and steal it all? That money is our future. It's the only thing keeping us afloat." On one particularly damning occasion, the two siblings had a screaming match via speakerphone right in the study, arguing over how they would divide the spoils, callously debating which of their mother's prized possessions they would sell first. Each night, after the house fell silent, Sarah would retrieve the recorder's memory card. Together, she and Eleanor would listen, the ugly, unvarnished truth of her children's greed filling the quiet room. Eleanor listened with a cold, detached calm. Every word was a nail, and she was building a coffin for the life her children thought they were going to have. The day of the final hearing dawned gray and oppressive, the sky a bruised, colorless canvas that mirrored the mood in the Vance family. The courtroom was the same sterile, impersonal box as before, but today the air was charged with a finality that made every whisper echo, every rustle of paper sound like a crack of thunder. Eleanor was positioned between her children like a fragile trophy, her performance of frailty now honed to a devastating perfection. Her head was slightly bowed, her hands resting limply in her lap, her gaze seemingly lost in the middle distance. To her children, she was a non-entity, the silent object of their dispute. They had long since stopped seeing the woman, focusing only on the prize. Michael was a portrait of predatory confidence. He sat ramrod straight in his tailored suit, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the judge. He believed his victory was assured, a simple matter of presenting the facts he had so carefully manufactured. Catherine, by contrast, had perfected her role as the sorrowful martyr. Dressed in a modest, dove-gray suit, she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her shoulders trembling with manufactured anxiety. She shot venomous, wounded glances at her brother, confident that her own secret recordings would expose him for the monster he was. They were two actors on a stage, ready for their final, dueling monologues, utterly oblivious to the fact that the play had been rewritten by a silent director. Michael's lawyer, methodical and precise, went first. He laid out a dispassionate case for Eleanor's incompetence, citing the medical reports he had commissioned. Then he called his star witness, Gina, the home health aide. The young woman walked to the stand, her face pale, avoiding Eleanor's gaze. Coached for hours by Michael and his legal team, she delivered a chillingly effective performance. With a voice full of feigned reluctance, she recounted fabricated stories of Catherine's supposed neglect. She spoke of a missed dose of blood pressure medication, of Catherine snapping impatiently at her mother when she spilled some tea, of overhearing tearful phone calls where Catherine complained about the unbearable burden of caregiving. Every word was a lie, polished to a high shine. "I just grew concerned," Gina concluded, her voice cracking on cue. Mrs. Vance seemed afraid of her daughter sometimes. Michael allowed a look of grim vindication to cross his face. Catherine's lawyer fought back in cross-examination, but Gina stuck to her script. The damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted in the judge's mind about Catherine's stability. But Catherine was holding an ace. Her lawyer called a recess to set up audio equipment. When they returned, her counterattack began. "We don't dispute that my client has been under strain," her lawyer announced to the court. A strain caused not only by her mother's condition, but by the relentless financial pressure and harassment from her brother, Michael Vance. She then played the recordings. The courtroom was filled with the sound of Michael's voice, captured from his desperate phone calls, raw and unfiltered. They heard him begging his creditors for more time. They heard him boasting about the fortune that was practically his. They heard the raw, naked desperation of a man on the brink of ruin. Michael's face went from confident to ashen. His carefully constructed image of the responsible, successful son evaporated in a hiss of static and damning words. Catherine permitted herself a tiny, triumphant smile. She had exposed his true motives. Checkmate. The judge, a man whose patience had been worn to a nub, looked down from his bench with an expression of profound disgust. He now saw the truth, or at least a version of it. He saw a daughter who was potentially negligent and emotionally unstable, and a son whose motives were steeped in greed and desperation. Neither was a suitable guardian. The room was thick with tension. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to deliver a verdict that would likely satisfy no one, probably the appointment of a neutral, third-party professional conservator, locking them both out of the fortune they craved. Michael and Catherine held their breath, their rivalry momentarily forgotten in their shared dread of a mutual loss. But just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, a calm, clear voice cut through the silence. "Your Honor." Every head turned. It was Mr. Harrison, Eleanor's own lawyer, who had sat silent and impassive throughout the entire sordid affair. He now stood tall, his expression unreadable. "Before you render your decision, my client, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, has a final piece of evidence she would like the court to consider." A wave of confusion rippled through the room. Michael and Catherine exchanged a bewildered, panicked glance. Their mother? Evidence? They had dismissed her as a silent pawn, a footnote in their own battle. The idea that she had a move to make was so inconceivable it was momentarily terrifying. The judge, intrigued, leaned forward. "Proceed, Mr. Harrison." Mr. Harrison gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards Sarah Jenkins, who was sitting in the gallery. She reached into her briefcase, and produced a small, digital audio player. The trap was about to be sprung. A murmur of confusion and anticipation went through the courtroom as Mr. Harrison placed the small digital player on his desk. Michael's and Catherine's lawyers were on their feet instantly, a chorus of loud, overlapping objections. "Your Honor, we have no knowledge of this so-called evidence," Michael's lawyer boomed. "Objection, improper foundation. We don't know where this came from, who recorded it, or if it has been tampered with," Catherine's lawyer added, her voice sharp with panic. "This is a clear violation of privacy, an illegal recording." Mr. Harrison waited calmly for their histrionics to subside. When silence was restored, he addressed the judge in a measured, steady voice. "Your Honor, the recordings were made by a voice-activated device located in the personal study of my client, within her own home. The conversations you are about to hear were not whispered in a private bedroom. They were spoken, often at high volume, in a common area of the house. Given that the subject of these conversations was the person and property of my client, Eleanor Vance, there can be no reasonable expectation of privacy. My client is prepared to testify that she authorized the recording for her own protection." He glanced at Eleanor, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. The judge, his face a thunderous mask of impatience, slammed his gavel. "I've heard enough theatrics for one day. The objections are overruled. Play the recording, Mr. Harrison." A deathly hush fell over the room. Mr. Harrison pressed a button. The first voice that filled the courtroom was Michael's, crystal clear, imbued with a sneering arrogance he had kept carefully hidden. It was his voice from his father's study, speaking to one of his creditors. "Look, just give me a few more weeks," Michael's recorded voice snarled. "The old woman is practically a ghost. Once the court signs off, I get the guardianship. I'm selling this dump, putting her in the cheapest facility I can find that won't look like a prison, and liquidating the whole portfolio. You'll get your money. Just calm down." The sound of his own unfiltered greed, his callous dismissal of his mother as the old woman, his plan to sell the home he grew up in and dump her in a cheap facility, it all echoed in the silent room. Michael's face went completely white. He stared at the audio player as if it were a venomous snake, his mouth slightly agape, a small, choked sound escaping his throat. He looked as if he had been physically struck. Before the court could fully absorb the shock, Mr. Harrison said, "There is another conversation, Your Honor. This one features both Mr. Vance and his sister, Catherine." He pressed play again. This time, it was a speakerphone argument between the siblings, recorded in that same study. Catherine's voice, shrill and furious, was the first to be heard. "Absolutely not, Michael. You think I'm going to let you take it all after everything I've done? I've been here day and night, changing her, feeding her, putting up with her moods. I have earned that money." Michael's voice shot back, equally venomous. "You've earned nothing. You're just playing the martyr to get your hands on the cash. I'm the one with the business sense, the one who knows how to handle the assets. You'd blow it all on designer shoes and a new car in 6 months." The recording continued, a horrifying testament to their true relationship. "That money," Catherine's voice shrieked, "is for Jack's Harvard tuition and our new house on the coast. It's our future. Your future." Michael laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "That inheritance is my birthright. It's the only thing that can save my company." They weren't arguing about their mother's care. They were vultures fighting over a carcass that was sitting 10 feet away from them, very much alive. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with the stench of betrayal. The truth, in all its raw, unvarnished ugliness, had been laid bare. Michael and Catherine were frozen in their chairs, their carefully constructed facades shattered into a million pieces. The successful son and the devoted daughter were gone, replaced by a desperate gambler and a terrified social climber. They could not look at the judge. They could not look at their lawyers. And they certainly could not look at each other. Their secret war was secret no longer, and in their mutual destruction, they were finally united. Then, for the first time that day, Eleanor moved. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. Her back straightened against the cushioned support of her wheelchair. The vacant, fragile look vanished from her eyes as if a veil had been lifted. In its place was a gaze of such piercing clarity and cold, righteous fury that it seemed to suck the very air from the room. She turned her head to the left and looked at her son. She held his gaze until he flinched, his eyes darting away in shame and terror. Then she turned her head to the right and fixed her eyes on her daughter. Catherine, who met her mother's stare for a single, horrifying second, let out a tiny, strangled sob, and her face crumpled in on itself. Eleanor had said nothing. She didn't have to. In that silent, final judgment, her children finally understood. This was not their tragedy, it was her masterpiece. The silence in the courtroom following the recording was a living entity, thick and suffocating. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of lies, the weight of avarice, and the shattering of a family. It was the judge who finally broke it. His voice no longer tired or impatient, but a low, rumbling thunder of pure, undiluted rage. He removed his glasses and leaned forward, his eyes boring into Michael and Catherine, who both flinched as if his gaze were a physical blow. "In my 20 years on this bench," he began, his voice dangerously quiet, "I have seen a great deal of human weakness. I have seen anger, desperation, and folly. But I do not think I have ever been a witness to such a grotesque theater of greed as I have seen today." He gestured with a dismissive wave at the stacks of legal documents on his desk. "You came into this courtroom cloaked in the language of love and concern, while your hearts were filled with nothing but the basest sort of avarice. You sought to have your mother declared incompetent, and yet it is you, her children, who have demonstrated a staggering degree of moral bankruptcy." He looked from Michael's ashen face to Catherine's tear-streaked, crumpled one. "You did not see a parent in need of care. You saw a balance sheet. You did not see a matriarch deserving of dignity. You saw an obstacle to your inheritance. You have weaponized the very concept of family, turning it into a cudgel with which to beat each other in your race to the bottom of a financial pit." His voice rose, shaking with fury. "This court will not be an accessory to such a monstrous betrayal." With a decisive slam of his gavel that made both siblings jump, he delivered his verdict. "The petitions for conservatorship filed by Mr. Michael Vance and Mrs. Catherine Duval are hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice. All legal and personal autonomy is fully and immediately restored to Mrs. Eleanor Vance. This hearing is concluded." But the proceedings were not truly over. The court's justice had been served, but Eleanor's was yet to be delivered. As lawyers began to shuffle papers and the spectators started to whisper, a new drama unfolded. Eleanor turned to Sarah, who stood by her side, and gave a slight, firm nod. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Then, Eleanor placed her own hands on the armrests of her wheelchair. A tremor ran through her arms as she pushed. Her knuckles went white. A low sound of pure, agonizing effort escaped her lips. Michael and Catherine watched, transfixed in horror, as their frail, helpless mother began to rise. It was a slow, unsteady, magnificent ascent. Her legs, which they had long dismissed as useless, trembled under the strain but held firm. Sarah was there, a steadying presence, but the will, the strength, it was all Eleanor's. She stood. Her spine, which for months had been a question mark of frailty, became an exclamation point of will. She let go of the wheelchair and took a single, shaky step forward. Then another. She stopped directly in front of her children, who stared up at her as if they were seeing a ghost. And then she spoke. Her voice, once trapped in a frustrating slur, was now painstakingly, chillingly clear. Each word was a perfectly formed stone, dropped into the silent well of their relationship. "You," she said, her voice raspy with disuse but ringing with power. Michael flinched. "Are." Catherine let out a choked sob. "No." The finality of the word hung in the air. Longer. The last vestige of hope died in their eyes. "My children." The last two words were not shouted, but they landed with the force of a physical blow, severing the final frayed thread of their familial bond. It was an excommunication, a verbal execution. As the weight of her words crushed what was left of her children's composure, Mr. Harrison stepped forward into the space Eleanor had created. He held a single, crisp document in his hand. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the still-seated judge. With her legal authority now fully restored, Mrs. Vance has one final matter to address the court with. It concerns her last will and testament, which she has recently amended. He did not look at Michael or Catherine, but spoke to the room at large. As of this morning, Eleanor Vance's prior will has been rendered null and void. A new legally binding document has been executed and filed. He unfolded the paper. All assets, properties, stocks, and liquid funds belonging to the estate of Eleanor and the late Robert Vance, in their entirety, are to be transferred into a newly created charitable trust. He paused, letting the words sink in. The trust will be called the Robert Vance Foundation for the Forgotten. Its mission, he continued, his voice clear and precise, will be to provide financial and legal support to elderly individuals who have been abused, abandoned, or financially exploited by their own families. It was a masterstroke of poetic justice. The very fortune they had debased themselves to acquire would now be used to protect others from people just like them. Mr. Harrison looked up from the paper and, for the first time, met the desperate, pleading eyes of Michael and Catherine. He delivered the final sentence with the cold, impersonal finality of an executioner. Under the terms of the new will, Michael Vance and Catherine Duval are to receive nothing. They are hereby and irrevocably disinherited. The justice delivered within the courtroom was merely the opening act. The true consequences, the slow and grinding mills of retribution, took place in the days and weeks that followed, far from the judge's authoritative gaze. For Michael and Catherine, the public humiliation was not an end, but the beginning of a personal apocalypse, a reaping of the bitter seeds they had so diligently sown. Their downfall was not identical. It was a punishment perfectly tailored to their individual sins. For Michael, the collapse was swift and brutal, an implosion of the hollow empire he had built on lies and leverage. The story of the Vance family hearing became the most salacious piece of gossip to sweep through their wealthy Connecticut enclave. It was whispered over cocktails at the country club and dissected in hushed tones at charity galas. The news traveled at the speed of scandal, and for Michael, it was a death sentence. The creditors he had held at bay with promises of his mother's fortune heard the verdict and descended like a pack of wolves. There were no more extensions, no more polite phone calls. There were only legal notices, demands for immediate payment, and the cold, unyielding machinery of bankruptcy. His company, Vance Development, which had always been more of a concept than a reality, folded in less than a month. The investors he had charmed pulled out their funds, and the banks called in his loans. His reputation, the only real currency he had ever possessed, was now radioactive. No one would do business with the man who tried to swindle his own mother. The German sports car was repossessed from the driveway of his glass-walled mansion. The mansion itself soon followed, a for-sale sign hammered into the pristine lawn like a tombstone for the life he once pretended to have. He was forced to move into a soulless, rented apartment, the generic beige walls a constant, mocking reminder of his failure. His bespoke suits were sold for pennies on the dollar, and his expensive watches were pawned. But the most profound loss was the illusion of his own importance. The friends who had once clapped him on the back and laughed at his jokes now crossed the street to avoid him. His phone, once buzzing with calls, fell silent. He was left with nothing but the crushing, suffocating weight of his own choices, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own ambition. Catherine's ruin was a slower, more intimate, and perhaps more painful affair. It was not the sudden explosion of a financial collapse, but the meticulous, agonizing deconstruction of a life built on a facade. Her husband, Mark, had married her for the lifestyle she represented, for the access to the Vance family wealth that promised a future of effortless comfort. When that future evaporated in a courtroom, so did his affection. He did not rage or scream. His cruelty was colder, more pragmatic. He sat her down at their polished dining room table, the site of countless perfect dinner parties, and laid it out like a business negotiation. "I can't do this, Catherine," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I didn't sign up for this, the shame, the struggle. It's not the life we agreed upon." He saw her not as a wife to support through a crisis, but as a failed investment to be written off. He left 2 weeks later, and his departure was the first domino in the collapse of her social world. The news of the divorce, on top of the courtroom scandal, made her a pariah. The invitations to luncheons and parties stopped arriving. When she dared to show her face at the local gourmet market, her former friends would suddenly become fascinated by a display of artisanal cheeses, turning their backs on her, their whispers following her down the aisle like a chill wind. Her meticulously curated social media presence became a gallery of ghosts, a painful archive of a life that was no longer hers. The perfect suburban home, now too large and too expensive, had to be sold. She found herself in a small, cramped apartment on the wrong side of town, the thin walls allowing her to hear the arguments of her neighbors. With no husband and no inheritance, she was forced to do something she had never contemplated: get a job. With no degree and no discernible skills beyond hosting parties, her options were bleak. She found work as a cashier at a high-end department store, the very kind of place where she used to be a pampered customer. Now, she spent her days on her feet, wearing a polyester uniform, forcing a smile for women who were living the life she had lost. Every scan of a platinum credit card, every condescending remark from a wealthy shopper, was a fresh, stinging reminder of her fall from grace. She was trapped in a hell of her own making, a living exhibit in the museum of her own failure. The story of the Vance children became a local cautionary tale, a modern fable about the poison of greed. They were the ghosts at the feast in their old community, their names invoked to frighten children into being grateful. They never saw their mother again. They were left to navigate the wreckage of their lives alone, united only by their shared disgrace and the bitter, unspoken knowledge that they had traded a mother's love and a vast fortune for a lifetime of regret and humiliation. The silence from their mother's new life was the most profound punishment of all, a constant, echoing reminder of the paradise they had willingly and foolishly lost. Eleanor Vance did not linger in the ruins of her old life. The grand Connecticut mansion, once a symbol of her family's legacy and happiness, now felt like an opulent tomb, haunted by the ghosts of what might have been. To heal, she knew she had to leave. The decision to sell the house was not made with sadness, but with a surgeon's clean, decisive precision. It was an amputation, a removal of a part of her life that had become septic with betrayal. She oversaw the process with a quiet dignity, instructing the estate agents to sell everything: the antique furniture her children had mentally appraised, the fine china they had coveted, the silver they had planned to divide. She kept only her books, her husband's photograph, and her personal mementos. The rest was just dead weight, the material trappings of a life she no longer recognized. She moved into a modern, sun-drenched apartment in a quieter part of the state, a place with large windows overlooking a park instead of the manicured lawns of a judgmental suburb. The space was smaller, but it felt infinitely larger, filled not with the oppressive silence of memory but with the quiet hum of a new beginning. And she was not alone. Sarah Jenkins, the woman the court had sent to be its eyes and ears, had become something more. In the crucible of the legal battle, a bond of profound trust and mutual respect had been forged. When Eleanor offered her a position not just as a caregiver, but as a chief of staff for her new life and a director for the foundation, Sarah accepted without hesitation. They had become a family of choice, a testament to the fact that the truest bonds are not always forged by blood, but by character. With the legal battles behind her and the vast fortune now a tool for good, Eleanor underwent a remarkable transformation. Her new purpose became the engine of her rebirth. She poured all of her sharp intellect and formidable will into the Robert Vance Foundation for the Forgotten. This was no passive, check-writing philanthropy. Eleanor was on the front lines. Every morning, Sarah would bring her case files, and together they would review the stories of elderly men and women trapped in situations sickeningly similar to her own. Her past experience had given her a unique, almost infallible instinct for detecting the scent of greed masked as concern. She could read a financial statement and see the subtle siphoning of funds. She could analyze a legal petition and recognize the manipulative language of a predator. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, using the very money her children had tried to steal to fund legal aid, to hire honest caregivers, and to provide safe housing for those who had been discarded. There was a profound, karmic beauty in it, turning the poison that had nearly destroyed her into medicine for others. This newfound purpose had a startling effect on her health. The immense stress of her children's betrayal had been a physical poison, constricting her muscles, clouding her mind, and stealing her voice. With that poison purged, her body began to heal. The defiant act of standing in the courtroom had been a turning point. She committed herself to physical therapy with the same iron will she applied to her foundation. The slurring in her speech began to fade, her words growing stronger and clearer each day. She began to walk, first with a walker, then with just a cane, her steps becoming more confident. The vacant look that she had once used as a shield was replaced by a bright, engaged intelligence. There was laughter in her new home, quiet conversations over tea with Sarah, and the deep, satisfying exhaustion that comes from a day of meaningful work. She was not just living, she was thriving. She never saw Michael or Catherine again, nor did she ever speak their names. It was not a decision born of lingering anger, but of a quiet, complete finality. They belonged to a different world, a different story that had already reached its conclusion. To speak of them would be to give them power, to allow their ghosts to haunt the new life she had so carefully built. Her silence was no longer the silence of a victim, but the serene quiet of a survivor who has closed a chapter forever. Friends and acquaintances who had watched the drama unfold often marveled at her resilience, but they misunderstood the nature of her struggle. They saw a frail woman who had been pushed to the brink and had miraculously fought back. They did not understand that her long, quiet endurance in that house, her patient suffering through their daily deceptions, was never a sign of weakness. It was a period of observation, of intelligence gathering. It was the silence of a general on a hilltop, watching the enemy's movements, waiting for them to overextend, allowing them to walk deeper and deeper into the trap she was setting in her mind. Her silence had been her greatest weapon, a crucible in which she had forged the perfect, unbreakable sword of justice. Years passed. The story of the Vance family faded from gossip into local legend, a cautionary tale told with a satisfying shiver. In her sunlit apartment, Eleanor lived out her final act, not in bitterness or regret, but in a state of quiet, purposeful grace. Her foundation flourished, becoming a shield for countless vulnerable elders, her name synonymous not with scandal, but with a fierce, intelligent form of compassion. She passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, leaving behind a legacy of strength and a world made slightly more just by her existence. It fell to Sarah, her loyal friend and chosen heir to her mission, to sort through the last vestiges of a remarkable life. It was during this somber task that the final, most shocking secret was revealed. In the bottom of an old cedar chest, beneath her late husband's university sweater and a bundle of faded love letters, Sarah found a small, simple journal. It was not one of the leather-bound volumes that had been used in court. This one was older, its cover worn, its pages filled with the shaky, uncertain script of someone relearning how to write. Sarah, thinking it would offer a final glimpse into her friend's painful recovery, sat down to read it. The first few entries were exactly as she expected. Expressions of frustration, rage against a body that would no longer obey, and the deep, cutting sorrow of a mother, realizing her children's true nature. But then, only a few months after the stroke, the handwriting began to change. It grew firmer, more confident, the loops and lines regaining their old, elegant authority. And then Sarah read an entry that made the air freeze in her lungs. It was dated nearly a full year before the final court hearing. "Dr. Mills was ecstatic today," Eleanor had written. "He called my progress a miracle. I took 5 unaided steps in his office, and my speech is nearly back to normal if I concentrate. He says I can leave the wheelchair behind for good within a month." I felt a surge of triumph. Until Michael visited this evening. He came bearing flowers, but he did not see me. He did not see the woman who was getting stronger. He saw an opportunity. He looked at my wheelchair, at my slow speech, and his eyes glittered with calculation. Catherine was the same yesterday. Her care is the care of a zookeeper, managing a beast she hopes will die soon so she can inherit the zoo. They think my mind is as weak as they need my body to be. Sarah paused, her heart pounding. The entry continued, and the full, breathtaking scope of Eleanor's strategy was laid bare. Perhaps this weakness is a gift, a shield, a stage upon which they can perform their final, truest act. I will not leave this chair. I will let my words remain slow. I will let them think they are in control. I will watch, and I will wait. Robert always told me, let your opponent reveal their entire strategy before you make your first move. My children are now my opponents. The game is afoot. Sarah put the journal down, her hands trembling. A wave of awe, so profound it was almost dizzying, washed over her. Eleanor Vance had not been a victim who had found the strength to fight back. She had been a master strategist from the very beginning. The stroke had not just been a medical crisis, it had been a moment of terrible, clarifying insight. It had given her the perfect camouflage. She had not been a pawn in her children's greedy game. She had been the silent puppet master, giving them just enough rope, patiently waiting for them to fashion their own nooses. Her frailty was a costume, her silence a script, and the entire, protracted family drama had been a magnificent, tragic play of her own direction, designed for one single, explosive finale in a courtroom. She was not a survivor. She was the architect of their downfall. In the play of life, sometimes the most fragile roles hide the strongest will. The story of Eleanor Vance serves as a final, chilling reminder. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. For in that silence, they are not just healing their wounds, they are sharpening the sword of justice. And when that sword finally falls, its cut is not only deep, but devastatingly, perfectly precise. The scales of justice always find their balance, eventually. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another story that delves into the intricate heart of the family.